Welcome, friends, to a heartwarming tale of unexpected twists, family bonds, and the power of second chances in love. Enjoy the story.
Emily gently closed the bedroom door, her heart heavy with concern for her husband. Mark had been pushing himself to the limit lately, so exhausted that he could barely stay awake. Tonight was no different. He had rushed home, eaten a quick plate of macaroni and cheese, and collapsed on the couch. His last words before drifting off were, "Em, wake me up in an hour. I need to go see Dad." Emily sighed, recalling their brief conversation. She had tried to tell him he had just visited 2 days ago, but Mark was already sound asleep. As she quietly walked to the kitchen, her mind was racing. Something had to change. Frank, her father-in-law, wasn't easy to deal with, but he was getting older and could no longer care for himself. "We might have to bring him here," Emily thought, absently stirring her tea. The idea made her shudder. Memories of past conflicts with Frank rushed back, leaving her uneasy. Unlike most people who struggle with their mothers-in-law, Emily's challenge was with her father-in-law. Frank had always been difficult. In the early years of her marriage to Mark, they had even lived with him, trying to save money. Frank's suburban house was anything but humble, though he liked to refer to it that way. But living there had been a constant struggle. Frank disapproved of nearly everything Emily did. The tension escalated when it came to their commute. Mark and Emily worked on opposite sides of the city, and they had worked out a fair system where they alternated weeks driving each other to work. But Frank hated it. "She's not a princess," he'd mutter, loud enough for Emily to hear. "She can take the bus." One night, after overhearing another lecture from Frank to Mark, Emily had enough. She calmly but firmly told Frank that while she understood his concern for his son, she and Mark were adults capable of making their own decisions. Frank had turned red with anger, shouting for Mark to control his wife. Mark had rushed down from their bedroom and defused the situation, but that night, they agreed. It was time to move out. Emily knew it was because of her, but she couldn't take it anymore. "I'm sorry, Mark," she whispered that night, taking his hand. "I never wanted to come between you and your dad." Mark squeezed her hand gently. "It's not your fault, Em. We'll find a place, and maybe some distance will help." The first 2 years after moving out were peaceful. Frank rarely visited, and Mark would help him on weekends. Emily went with him occasionally, doing her best to be polite. But their conversations were limited, and tensions simmered just below the surface. However, over the past year, things had changed. Frank had fallen ill, and Mark had been spending more and more time at his father's house. Emily understood. Frank was Mark's only living relative. Still, Mark was working long hours and growing more exhausted by the day. The strain was starting to take a toll on their marriage. Tonight, after watching Mark collapse into an exhausted sleep, Emily had made a decision. She would go to Frank's house herself. She grabbed her keys and headed out the door, determined to help in whatever way she could, whether delivering groceries, cleaning up, or simply being there. As Emily navigated the busy streets, her thoughts tumbled over each other. "I shouldn't be feeling this way," she chastised herself. Frank was family, and Mark needed her support. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling of resentment that had been growing inside her. She and Mark had just bought their first home, a modest 2-bedroom apartment with plans for a family in the future. They should have been focusing on building their life together, not constantly dealing with Frank's needs. When Emily turned onto Frank's street, she noticed something strange. His house was brightly lit, and music floated through the air. She slowed down, bewildered. Wasn't Frank supposed to be too ill to take care of himself? And yet, the house was lit up like a party was going on. She parked and cautiously approached the house, her confusion growing. As she walked through the gate, she saw people in the backyard laughing and dancing. There was a grill set up, and the smell of food wafted through the air. Emily blinked in disbelief. Frank was at the grill, laughing and joking with a group of people, looking healthier than she had seen him in years. Just then, a man in his 60s, clearly tipsy but friendly, noticed her standing by the entrance. "Hey there, don't just stand there. Come on in," he called out, waving her over. Emily was too stunned to respond immediately. The man peered at her curiously. "Wait, you're not Natalie, are you?" he asked, scratching his head. "No, I'm Emily," she managed to say, still in shock. "Ah, Emily," the man exclaimed, his face lighting up. "Frank told me about you. Come on in, he'll be thrilled to see you." Emily hesitated but followed the man into the backyard. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Frank, who Mark had described as barely able to get out of bed, was now hosting what looked like a lively backyard party. Before she could gather her thoughts, a warm voice spoke from behind her. "You must be Emily." Emily turned to see a kind-looking woman with twinkling eyes. "I'm Natalie," the woman said with a smile. "Frank's fiancée." "Fiancée?" Emily echoed, completely taken aback. Natalie laughed softly. "Yes, we're celebrating tonight. Our engagement. Frank's been talking about you, you know." Emily's head was spinning. She had come to help care for a sick, bedridden man, only to find him celebrating an engagement. What is going on? She wondered. Frank spotted her from across the yard and waved her over. "Emily, what a surprise. Is something wrong with Mark?" he asked, his voice full of concern. "No, Mark's fine," she replied, still trying to make sense of everything. "I thought I'd come by since Mark's been coming here so much." Frank looked puzzled. "Mark? He's barely been by these last few months. Only a few times to ask for money. I thought you were both still mad at me." Emily's stomach dropped. "Mark's been telling me he's here every day, helping you with groceries, medications, everything," she said, her voice shaking slightly. Frank raised an eyebrow. "Emily, I haven't needed any of that. I'm as healthy as I've ever been." Emily's heart sank as the realization hit her. Mark had been lying to her for months. Everything she thought she knew about the situation, about their life, was unraveling before her eyes. Later that night, as the party wound down and the guests left, Emily sat on the couch, feeling emotionally drained. She couldn't stop replaying the events of the evening in her head. Mark had been lying not just about his visits to his father, but about everything. When her phone rang and Mark's name appeared on the screen, she felt a wave of anger. "Where are you?" Mark asked, his voice sharp. "I'm at your dad's," Emily replied, her voice steady. "Where have you really been going all this time?" There was silence on the other end of the line. When Mark finally spoke, his voice was cold and dismissive. "That's none of your business." Emily's heart broke a little more with each word. She had known something was wrong, but this betrayal cut deep. She ended the call, her hands shaking. For the first time in a long while, she let the tears fall. Frank and Natalie, sensing her distress, offered her a place to stay for the night. Over the next week, as the truth of Mark's lies continued to sink in, Emily made a life-altering decision. She filed for divorce. Frank didn't try to talk her out of it. Instead, he and Natalie became her biggest supporters, offering her a new kind of family she hadn't expected. Months passed, and Emily slowly rebuilt her life. She found a small apartment, poured herself into her work, and began to rediscover who she was outside of her marriage to Mark. The pain of betrayal still lingered, but she was healing, one day at a time. A year later, Emily stood in front of the mirror, smoothing down her dress. Today was her wedding day, but this time everything felt right. She had met David, a kind and gentle man, at a community gardening event, and he had shown her what real partnership and love looked like. As she walked down the aisle, Frank stood proudly at her side, ready to give her away. The ceremony was simple but full of love. When it was time for the vows, Emily's voice trembled with emotion as she spoke. "David, you came into my life when I needed you most. You've shown me what true love looks like, and I promise to walk by your side through all of life's adventures." As she exchanged vows with David, surrounded by friends and family, including Frank and Natalie, Emily knew she had found her true happiness. Life had taken unexpected twists and turns, but it had led her exactly where she was meant to be. She had lost something, but in the process, she had gained so much more: love, family, and a future full of hope.